So, hi everyone. Thank you for attending this virtual panel discussion on the life and work of Emma Stebbins. I'm Carly Wurzelbacher, Chief Curator of the Heckscher Museum of Art and the organizer of Emma Stebbins Carving Out History. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from three of the exhibition catalog authors who will introduce themselves and present the research that they explore in greater depth in the book. We should have time at the end for your questions, which you can send to us via Zoom's Q&A function. But first, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the show and book. While the Bethesda Fountain in New York City Central Park has been a global icon since 1873 and is now visited by about 40 million people a year, its creator is virtually unknown. As the first ever museum exhibition on the artist, Carving Out History examines the full scope and impact of Stebbins's prominent transatlantic career. The exhibition brings together 14 of her rare marble sculptures, 5 of which are held in the collection of the Heckscher Museum. A special highlight is Joseph the Dreamer, a loan from the Belfast Central Library in Northern Ireland, which is making its U.S. debut in the show. Stebbins was born in 1815 and spent the first 4 decades of her life in New York City. She moved to Rome to pursue a career in sculpture when she was in her 40s. From 1857 to 1870, she created innovative marble and bronze sculptures while living with her wife, renowned Shakespearean actress Charlotte Cushman. As we'll see, her body of work encompasses inventive and incisive interpretations of literary and biblical subjects, unprecedented allegories of American industry, moving portrait busts of friends and family members, and path-breaking public monuments. The exhibition begins by exploring Stebbins's approach to neoclassicism through her sculptures of the Lotus Eater and the related work Autumn or Bacchus. The full-length version of the Lotus Eater, now considered lost, is the earliest male nude sculpted by a female American artist. When Stebbins showed it in New York City in 1861, the New York Times reported that it was, quote, worshipped daily by many a fair dame and all the critics of the city. The second section of the show introduces Stebbins's chosen family by bringing together portraits in paint, marble, photography, and print to provide an overview of her biography and the social and cultural contexts in which she worked. The show includes a portrait of Stebbins as a young woman by her painting instructor, Henry Inman, as well as Stebbins's bust of Cushman, which she showed at the Women's Pavilion at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition toward the end of her career. The third section of the exhibition looks at 2 pairs of sculptures, Industry and Commerce and Machinist and Machinist's Apprentice, to examine the production of marble sculpture in the context of industrialization and its impact on the environment. These 4 works are among the first sculptural representations of American laborers. Throughout the show, visitors see reproductions of 19th century photographs of Stebbins's work, such as this one in the middle of a California gold miner. Some of these images document lost marble sculptures, but most of them show clay studies or plaster casts that Stebbins never translated into stone or bronze. The 4th section focuses on the original intentions and the 150-year reception history of the Bethesda Fountain. With this work, Stebbins became the first woman to complete a public art commission in New York City. Her allegorical fountain celebrates the Croton Aqueduct, the infrastructure that brought clean water to the city following a cholera outbreak in the 1830s. Designed during the U.S. Civil War, it remains a rare monument to peace, health, and healing. The book and show also examine how the Bethesda Fountain has accrued meaning over time. At the turn of the century, it appeared in stereographs and tourist postcards. Artists including William Merritt Chase, Martha Edelheit, and Ricky Flores have centered the sculpture in their own work. And in the 1990s, Tony Kushner's two-part play, Angels in America, reanimated the Angel of the Waters as a symbol of hope and commemoration in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And we're very grateful to Tony Kushner for writing the foreword to the catalog. The exhibition concludes by placing Stebbins' work in the context of the Civil War and considers the monuments she made during this time. For example, Horace Mann, on the grounds of the Massachusetts State House in Boston, celebrates the abolitionist who created our public school system and who championed education for women and girls. To connect the show to today's discussions about monuments, the Heckscher invited a dozen contemporary artists to propose new public artworks, and their sketches and designs are projected onto the gallery wall, as you can see at far right. The publication Emma Stebbins Carving Out History includes scholarly essays, reflections by contemporary artists, a comprehensive plate section and chronology, and an appendix with historical texts by Stebbins herself and by her sister. As we'll now hear from three of the book's authors, Stebbins' art speaks to some of the most compelling issues of her time and ours, including gender and sexuality, ecology and industry, and political conflict and public art. And with that, I would like to welcome Professor Katrin Horn to the screen.
Thank you very much for having me in the book and here today as well. So my name is Katrin Horn. I'm a professor of gender studies and American studies at the University of Greifswald in Germany. And from this disciplinary background, you can probably guess that my introduction to Emma Stebbins was actually not through her sculpture. Rather, it was in the context of my research on US American celebrity culture in the 19th century. And for this, in particular, the expatriate community of US American artists living in Rome in the 50s to 70s proved immensely fertile. Which brings us to why I'm here today. For the exhibition catalog, I was tasked with placing Stebbins in this context of the expatriate culture and to trace her intellectual and social connections as the basis and frame for her artistic output. And today I'll try to provide a condensed version of the key insights. Ultimately, it shows this kind of four-part structure for my explanation of how Stebbins was embedded in various networks, from British feminists to US American abolitionists, to other women in non-conventional relationships, to just simply artists. How she contributed to these networks. Networks are not one-way streets, and how they influenced her life and how she was, influenced her life and work. I was mainly trying to show also how, as you see reflected in the title of my contribution, At Home Abroad, the complex negotiation of space was underlying her career. So how did Stebbins make a career abroad while she remained tied to the quote-unquote homeland? And how did she make a home in that new space that also at the same time was very central to her public career? Speaking of a public-private divide, that also is crucial to the sources on which you can build this kind of story of her life. If you look at the public sources, there's a wide variety that will easily show you how well connected Stebbins was. I'm just giving you very, very scanned overview of examples here, but you have, for example, the ultimate best-selling author of 19th century US, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, describing her life in Rome, and here mentioning Stebbins as one of the agreeable neighbors that made living in Rome so pleasant. You have a poem that is supposedly inspired by her statue, and then you have her mentioned in biographies of other famous women, in this case, Maria Mitchell, the astronomer. What you see here is clearly that her name meant something to the general public, otherwise why mention them? And then you also clearly see kind of the wide spectrum of people that were familiar with her or that spent time with her. To a certain extent, you see the same thing in her private documents. Here you have an example of an album in which she is part of, just like other important figures in Rome. But what you also get is the contrast to that. A lack of sources. There is no diary left by Stebbins. There are very few letters, and those letters are not in any collection that is dedicated to her. Those are all letters that are in other people's collections, for example, John Durand or Anne Whitney. And thus also extensively relied on the diaries and letters of other people that reference Stebbins, most importantly, clearly Charlotte Cushman. But I relied on these to get a better sense of, if not her voice, because it's not her letters, then at least of her actions and habits. Key among them, probably also not surprisingly, since she was living in Rome, was travel. For Stebbins and her peers, planning and taking trips together, visiting one another, delivering letters and packages and all of that was a central mode of creating connections. Sometimes also the days spent on transatlantic ocean liners actually allowed her to socialize with people who would then help her get commissions, as in this quote that refers to supposedly one of the earliest moments of getting closer to the Bethesda Fountain Commission. Equally important as her own travels were the travels of other people, namely those supposedly buying her sculptures. The tradition of the Grand Tour ensured a steady stream of American tourists who were convinced that to, quote, obtain a refined way of living, one naturally had to travel to Europe. And their enthusiasm for Rome and its artistic heritage was bolstered by the mass availability of travel handbooks, such as the Handbook of Rome and its Environs, and importantly, the myriad newspaper columns and magazines that offered gossip, quote unquote, from Rome. So clearly there was a certain level of public scrutiny, right? They need to gossip about something. But Rome, nonetheless, for many artists, was a place of freedom, both professionally and personally. In the words of Frances Power Cobbe, who was also a personal friend of Stebbins, American women in particular seemed to find in Italy a congenial sphere for the development of the more marked individuality, which characterizes them. For Stebbins, this, among others, meant the freedom to pursue the relationship with Cushman. Not that the physical removal from the US entirely moved her out of the sphere of influence of her family. We get from Cushman's letters clear indicators that there were lots of instances where they still clashed, but nonetheless. Similarly, for all the professional possibilities opened up by transnational travel, Stebbins was clearly still under the influence of US ideals of gendered behavior, since most of her customers were still US American, or at least Anglophone. Stebbins in particular might have felt this pressure to conform to standard ideas of femininity, since she arrived at Rome at the rather advanced age of 42 and was the daughter of a well-known family instead of some kind of prodigy. So in contrast to the often very intentionally controversial Harriet Hosmer, Stebbins was described in public reporting mostly as graceful, amiable, and charming, and obviously very intentionally so. Despite her differences and the competition, clearly, among the various sculptors, the relationship with these sculptors was among her most sustained in Rome. Besides Harriet Hosmer, there's also Margaret Foley and Florence Freeman as regular guests of Cushman and Stebbins. William Whitmer Story and his family were a constant presence in their lives as well. And then there was Anne Whitney, who, at least based on the evidence that we still have, was her most important correspondent when it came to her thoughts about religions, relationships, but also about art and the books that she was reading on art history and what she wanted to share about them. Reading, actually, generally, was one of the key ways in which Stebbins stayed connected. We learn from Cushman's letters how closely they both followed the American news, especially about the Civil War and how much it impacted them. We understand that they were the first US Americans to have read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Marble Faun in Europe. We also learned that they were avid readers of the Atlantic Monthly, which they took supposedly great comfort in. Stebbins and Cushman, furthermore, seem to have been regular observers of what was written about them in the US. At least once, Cushman tried to actively intervene, building on the network that they had built, among others with important publishers, such as James T. Fields and Annie Fields, when Cushman felt that the criticism of the Bethesda Fountain was going too far. At the same time, we also learned from the scanned correspondence that we still have of Stebbins that she also intervened on the behalf of others. For an unnamed friend, for example, she was trying to get the Crayon to publish the English translation of a French story, and there are further letters that attest to her support of other artists. As these letters to the US stress, Stebbins' life in Rome was profoundly shaped by her physical removal from the US. Waiting for letters, for books, for magazines, or being rushed to finish them in time for mail day, or making travel arrangements were often repeated concerns in her correspondence. Yet, Stebbins was not only abroad, but also at home in Rome. And this map is just there to give you a rough idea of how densely populated the expatriate community basically was in Rome, and how densely also how close-knit, close to each other they were. And I think it's also a good visual representation of the dense structure of Stebbins' daily life. Rise at 7, breakfast at 8, work in the studio until lunch at 1:30, horseback riding in the afternoon, dinner at 5, and then, quote, stay at home to receive guests or go out to pay them. While this list of daily activities might seem mundane at first glance, it had crucial implications, both socially and financially. This is particularly true for her role as one of the key figures of those, quote, semi-public performance spaces at which Anglo-Americans entertained each other at home, that is, salons. This best description of Stebbins' home as the place of the salon comes from her own pen, namely her detailed description of her apartment in Cushman's biography. You probably don't have time to read all of this. You need to get to the catalog for that, which is fine. But if you just look at the length of the description, I think it becomes clear how much sentimental value these rooms still had for her, even after all the time had passed. And yet, they were more than simply a home. Contemporary newspapers and private documents attest to the popularity of Stebbins and Cushman's salon with the support of Sally Mercer as kind of organizer. Beginning in the January of 1859, their evening gatherings of up to 175 people were attended by the likes of the Hawthorns, Cobb, William Medlow Story, but also various travelers through Rome. While Cushman often complained about the strain the duty of hospitality put on their household and their health, she and Stebbins were acutely aware of its importance in maintaining their position within their transnational networks. Additionally, one indicates how these gatherings could also strengthen the shared national identity of American expatriates when he's writing that his, quote, most pleasant recollections of my visit to Rome were associated with the home of Miss Cushman and Miss Stebbins. They kept the most agreeable American house in those days. But there's another central semi-public performance space for Stebbins beside her salon, and that was clearly her studio. In the studio, Stebbins entertained fellow expatriates, as we can see here in the diary of Sophia Peabody Hawthorne. She also received fellow artists, exchanged tools, and so forth. But beyond these more immediately practical and social aspects, the importance of the studio visit for artists was at least twofold. There were a chance to find new customers and to ensure good press. An 1866 report, for example, lets us know it's mostly about an insurance case of Stebbins' Joseph the Dreamer, but we nonetheless know that all American tourists to Rome would have, or at least should have, seen the statue when they last visited Stebbins' studio, and that also that the eventual buyer saw it there first. Additionally, a woman's experience in Europe highlights another vital function of studios, namely to let artists guide their public image. The author here remembers a visit to Stebbins' studio as a study in contrast between the dirty work of, actually producing sculpture, but then the ladylike artists, and thus a confirmation of Stebbins' adherence to standards of feminine propriety, even as she transgressed what was supposed her, social sphere in life. So to conclude, Stebbins successfully navigated this complex field of sociability for more than a decade while producing some of the finest examples of neoclassical sculpture from the period. The latter, in fact, would not have been feasible without the former. Through traveling, letter writing, reading, and hosting, Stebbins ensured strong relations with the US, even while she was living and working in Rome. And while it is impossible to trace the complexity of Stebbins' social relations in full, especially given the relative dearth of her own voice and archival records, the exemplary relationships outlined here make clear that Stebbins' network was wide as it was varied, both close-knit and transnational. Tracing Stebbins' social ties and her maneuvering of the demands of both a transnational career and a life on the margins of gender expectations paints a highly illuminating picture of her as an artist, both typical of her time and unique among her peers. And with that, I would hand over to Laura. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katrine. And thank you also to Carly and the Heckscher Museum for organizing and hosting today. My name is Laura Turner-Igoe. I am the Jerry and Marguerite Lendfest Chief Curator at the Michener Art Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And I was actually unfamiliar with Emma Stebbins until I was approached by Carly about writing for the catalog. She was interested in me helping situate Stebbins' work and materials in a wider environmental and material context, which has been a focus of my past research and publications. And honestly, it was wonderful to bring that lens to an artist that was new to me, And I appreciate all the groundwork that Carly, Ketrin, and Melissa have laid for this artist too. So in 1874, Emma Stebbins wrote to her friend, the poet and sculptor Anne Whitney, lamenting the physical toll of sculpting. She wrote, quote, "An artist ought to take the easiest groove possible. Otherwise, the labor of mind and body could be too severe. If there is any divine gift, all the material things should be made as easy as possible." End quote. This passage speaks to Stebbins' intimate knowledge of the interconnectedness of materials, labor, and well-being, as well as her own declining health as she struggled with an ongoing respiratory illness likely caused or exacerbated by inhaling marble dust from carving. Throughout her career, Stebbins expressed a keen interest in conceptions of work and industry and the impact of environment and materials upon the physical body. In my brief time today, I will show how a close analysis of two of Stebbins' most celebrated sculptures, Industry and Commerce, reveals the entanglement of Stebbins' work with environmental conditions and change in the mid-19th century, as she created allegorical figures of modern labor that radically transformed the natural environment and impacted public health. In 1859, Charles August Heckscher, a New York businessman, commissioned Stebbins to create, quote, two small figures representing mining and commerce under the forms of a miner and sailor, end quote. The resulting sculptures, some of the earliest she carved in marble, were praised by critics. A reviewer in the New York Times described Industry and Commerce as patriotic and symbolic of American work ethic, writing, quote, "The whole spirit of American labor, honest, fearless, young, high-spirited yet manly, dignified, respectful, and self-respecting, speaks in these stately and graceful figures," end quote. As this review illuminates, Industry and Commerce are steeped in ideas about labor at a moment when the nature of work in America was radically shifting from skilled craftsmanship to industrial toil, with a seismic impact on environments and workers. These two sculptures project an idealization of the workman that ignores the actual conditions and environmental changes wrought by international commerce and the growing American mining industry. So the subjects of Industry and Commerce are representative of the trades that secured the wealth of Stebbins' patron. Born in Paris to a wealthy Jewish family of merchant bankers, Charles August Heckscher emigrated from Hamburg to the US in 1829. Charles August and his younger brother, Edward Heckscher, invested in the trade of silver from Mexico, imported tea, gunpowder, and silk from China, and exported the products of enslaved labor in the US and the Caribbean, including tobacco, sugar, and cotton. The consumption and trade of these products had a devastating impact on local environments and indigenous peoples. But none of these concerns are captured within the figure of commerce, which does not include any details related to the goods that the sailor would have helped transport. Heckscher next entered the coal mining industry, producing, marketing, and transporting anthracite coal from eastern Pennsylvania through the benevolently named Forest Improvement Company, or FIC, which he founded in 1837. In the early 19th century, coal in eastern Pennsylvania was abundant. According to one mining prospectus, quote, "The coal is immediately perceived breaking out today in the roads and ravines, in beds of streams, and on the sides and summits of the mountains," end quote. The lithograph of a coal mine at Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania, that I'm showing you now by George Lehman, shows miners excavating exposed coal from the side of a hill, seeming to support this claim of abundance. As demand for anthracite coal increased, the amount of coal shipped rose from 6,500 to 79,973 tons a year between 1825 and 1829. Despite these declarations of plenitude, anthracite coal was becoming harder to obtain by the 1830s when Heckscher founded FIC. Illustrations in Henry Darwin Rogers' The Geology of Pennsylvania show an area transformed by the mining industry as carts traverse a scarred landscape. Coal mining had a profound impact on local environments, public health, and miner safety. Many mines employed children as young as 8 to sort and process coal by hand. These breaker boys who worked in colliery labor in the these breaker boys who worked in breakers or coal processing plants discarded small pieces of coal which washed into streams and local watersheds, creating acidic water conditions. There was also issues, of course, with pumping groundwater from deep mines, which dried up wells and formed sinkholes. And the human cost of anthracite mining in Pennsylvania was also very high. Scholars have estimated that 1 in 130 miners died each year at mid-century. Improvement companies like Heckscher's FIC purchased land and opened and prepared coal mines by sinking shaft mines, erecting breakers, and financing the development of the mining region. By 1860, when Stebbins completed her sculptures, FIC's property extended over 15,000 acres and included the 5 largest, most productive collieries in the region. Heckscher's influence and land holdings were so immense that he named the seat of his Pennsylvania anthracite empire Heckscherville, which you can see. You're looking at a collier breakery photograph from Heckscherville. The consumption and production of coal also linked these two figures of industry and commerce, as international trade was reliant on steamships that burned the non-renewable energy of coal. Stebbins and the sculptures themselves would have traveled to the United States from Rome on a steamship, so coal also powered their transportation and eventual critical reception. Heckscher commissioned industry and commerce from Stebbins at a key moment of shifting perceptions of work, from skilled craftsmanship to industrial labor in the United States. As corporate monopolies like FIC amassed greater control of coal mining in the mid-19th century, wage laborers did not reap the success of their efforts, and industry leaders, who benefited disproportionately from the achievements of their businesses, did not engage in the actual work. While Stebbins' industry and commerce represent the sectors through which Heckscher made his fortune, that is, mining and trade respectively, they also depict work that Heckscher did not himself undertake. When displayed in Heckscher's home, these sculptures additionally projected Heckscher's possession of the bodies that earned him his fortune. So industry and commerce, of course, do not reference the environmental degradation and bodily harm intertwined with the mining of coal. They instead romanticize contemporary notions of labor, depicting bodies at rest rather than bodies at toil. Industry, for example, stands in classical contrapposto with his left hand on an outcropping of rock and his right hand holding a pick against his shoulder. His shirt is open low on his chest and his sleeves are rolled up, alluding to the physical exertion of his work that is not otherwise represented. This statue stands in contrast to contemporary photographs of miners at rest that emphasize their precarious position within the anthracite mines, and also later social realist sculptures by artists like Constantin-Emile Meunier, whose bronze miner at the vein contorts within a tight, precarious underground space as he pries at a vein of coal. Indeed, the material of Stebbins' industry, which one critic described as, quote, an unusually pure block of the whitest marble, end quote, does not accurately depict the dust-covered bodies of actual miners, presenting instead a sanitized depiction of the laborer removed from his working environment. In her selection of smooth, refined marble, Stebbins was also working within the artistic conventions and preferences of her day. As art historian Charmaine Nelson has argued, however, uncolored 19th century marble sculptures uphold a cultural ideal of a racially pure and chaste whiteness, divorced from context, environment, and condition. Industry and commerce acknowledge labor not just through their subjects, but in the very materiality of the sculptures themselves. Industry in particular can be viewed as a declaration of Stebbins' own labor in transforming the marble block into a refined, finished piece. The figure leans upon a tall rock that we, as viewers, are meant to imagine as an impediment to, or perhaps the container of, the anthracite coal the miner seeks. Unlike Stebbins' meticulous delineation of the miner's satiny skin and clothing, she left tool marks on the rock and base. She also prominently signed her name directly under the rock, firmly declaring her authorship, and you can see it on the image on your left, on the base, her signature. The juxtaposition of the smoothly and roughly worked surfaces calls attention to the mechanical process by which Stebbins transformed a rough marble block into a classically inspired figure. The statue therefore invites viewers to associate the act of mining coal with that of carving marble. Indeed, one contemporary critic noticed this connection, writing that the figure's left hand rests, quote, with the carelessness of manly strength upon a block of marble, drilled and hewn in the manner of a mass of coal, end quote. Stebbins notably often refused assistance in her studio in order to control the creation of her marble sculptures from initial idea to finished product, and to thwart the questioning of artistic authorship that plagued her professional rival, Harriet Hosmer. And this was a questioning of authorship that especially women sculptors face, not necessarily male sculptors, who all really relied on additional help in the studio to carve marble in particular. In 1864, Charlotte Cushman complained about the toll that carving took upon Stebbins's own body. Quote, that she should be classed among those who would be believed to have their work done for them makes her too miserable, and to struggle along without the material help which all sculptures must have has become so entirely a necessity to her that she is assuming labor for which she has neither physical nor mental strength, end quote. Many years of carving her own sculptures and inhaling marble dust aggravated Stebbins's lungs, causing recurring respiratory illness. Prolonged inhalation of marble dust also affected those workers who quarried the Carrara and Saravezza marble in Tuscany's Apuan Alps, which was used by Stebbins and her peers in Rome and elsewhere. Stebbins may not have directly connected her own labor to that of the quarrymen who excavated the material she later refined in her Roman studio, but American sculptors in Rome were frequently involved in the assessment and procurement of marble and sometimes visited the quarries to make their selection. Besides the stone outcropping upon which the miner leans and rests his left hand and the roughly textured base, industry elides any direct reference to the strenuous work of excavating coal and marble or Stebbins's own efforts in corresponding poor health in shaping and manipulating the hard stone. The resulting figure, along with his mate, Commerce, projects a classicizing, clean, and domesticated visualization of labor for Stebbins's patron, reassuring Heckscher and his peers of their wealth while distancing them from the environmental and social exploitation upon which they built their success. In conclusion, Stebbins's sculptures engage with environmental conditions and industrial labor in a variety of ways, at times recognizing but also obfuscating these concerns and realities. The eco-critical approach employed here helps us recontextualize these sculptures within the shifting environments which they represent, materialize, and for which they were created, connecting them to a wide range of places, peoples, and conditions across the country and the globe. Thank you very much, and I will turn this over to Melissa.
There we go. Hello, and I am unmuted. Excellent. I am Dr. Melissa Gustin. I am the curator of British art at National Museums Liverpool, and have apparently forgotten how to share my screen. There we go. And I was super excited to be involved in this because I did my PhD on Emma Stebbins and Harriet Hosmer several years ago, and so it was hugely exciting to be part of this and to have more people find out about Emma. When it felt like when I was doing my PhD, there were about 6 of us. So it's really fantastic. So my research for the exhibition focused on Emma Stebbins' angelic subjects, including the Angel of the Waters, but also slightly lesser well-known works, Sandalphon and Satan. And Satan was a never realized work by Stebbins that is only preserved in the sketchbook, which is so, or the scrapbook, which is so phenomenally reproduced in the catalog. So I will briefly talk about some of these works and some of the sources. And my PhD and research on Emma Stebbins over the years has largely focused on her classical citations and the ways that the women neoclassical artists were as much, or even often more so, invested in a very critical and intellectual and literary form of reception studies, where they knew their Roman milieu incredibly well. They knew the fabric of art history in their environments, and they thought very seriously about how to translate abstract ideals from poetry and history and mythology using classical references or existing art historical references for their equally well-educated and visually aware audiences. And so one of the things I was absolutely delighted by on the catalog was to have the Lotus Eater on the catalog cover as a work by Emma Stebbins, which has so often been sold for my interest in gender studies as well as things like an ideal maiden or a shepherd girl, when in fact it is a masculine nude, as we've heard, the first male nude sculpture by an American woman. So Sandalphon, which was fantastic to see in the exhibition, was based on a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I will not read you the whole poem because I am not a poetry person and I have no natural rhythm, but it's worth picking out a few of the key verses because it is interesting to think about how Stebbins transformed an entirely literary idea with some quite difficult description into a parlor-sized sculpture. So this poem is about Sandalphon, the angel of prayer from the Talmudic tradition, not a figure like the Archangel Gabriel or Michael, for whom there are centuries, if not millennia, of visual tradition. So Stebbins was essentially inventing a visual iconography for this figure. And the key descriptions from this, which is heavily gendered, by the way, the poem consistently refers to the angel as he, which is very interesting, as we shall see, with descriptions such as he gathers the prayers as he stands, and they change into flowers in his hands, into garlands of purple and red. It's a white statue. And beneath the great arch of the portal, through the streets of the city immortal, is wafted the fragrance they shed. He is described as his pinions in nebulous bars. So this sort of ethereal figure. In the Talmudic tradition, he is described as 500 years tall, and as a flaming wheel. So these are things that are very difficult to translate into white marble for a relatively visually conservative American audience. When it was described to peers, it was described by Cushman as a child's angel, in quotes, that the statue is, quote, sweet, pure, calm, innocent, patient, and receptive. The size is lovely for a drawing room. And it's interesting that Stebbins chooses this work, this title, this poem, for her sculpture, but also, let's see if I can find my slightly better photos of it. Sorry, this is the fourth talk I have done today on the third subject, so I am very much mentally catching up. There we go. That it is not particularly masculine, according to the description of the poem, but that in fact it's very almost neutrally gendered. It's tapping into an idea of angels being neuter or non-gendered. And it's not also as sexy as some angels or as powerful. And I think that description of the child's angel is really key here, but it's not that straightforward. And I was very grateful to be allowed to describe the flowers in the garland as penetrable, because I think there is a real tension between Stebbins' sexuality, her relationship with Cushman, and this presentation in some of her angelic subjects, that this is what we would call, it's a very hieratic sculpture, it's very staid, but then right around the area that you would expect to see the angel's genitals, to be fairly coarse, you have these budding roses, these garlands that hint at the body underneath these relatively shapeless robes, which do not come across as a dress. They're not sort of figure flattering in any way, but suggest a sort of gender neutrality and a denial of the body that is then undermined by these flowers held in a very provocative position. And this is somewhat contrasted with Thomas Crawford's Peri at the Gates, which is taken from Islamic mythology. A Peri was a spirit, an angel without a soul who desperately wanted to get into heaven and was sent out to essentially earn access to heaven. And this is a very long, it's based on a very long poem from 1817 in which the Peri is consistently sent away weeping. And there's nothing in the poem that suggests the angel has to be shown with one breast revealed, but it provides a gendered narrative for the feminine figure who wants redemption, as opposed to this non-threatening, non-sexualized, quote unquote, child's angel that Stebbins produces. And let's see what I've got. So then this is then contrasted quite sharply with the Angel of the Waters, which was, as we've heard, is now visited by 40 million people a year, so iconic and so not as well known as it should be with Emma Stebbins and her gender. And this work, which has moved towards a more traditional exposition of femininity with the breasts and a slightly more emphasized hips, was in fact described in both heavily gendered and derogatory terms for that gendering as well. In reviews, it was criticized for not being feminine enough, while also being too feminine, and described as a belle picking up a handkerchief in a ballroom, but also an old maid. At the same time, where it was criticized as not being feminine enough and having a rather masculine face and body while still being feminine. One reviewer even consistently referred to the figure as it. And there feels like a sense that this was in part because such an important commission went to a woman who, in many ways, was defying traditional American heteronormative femininity at the time through her relationship with Charlotte Cushman, through her professional attribution and her professional aspirations, really, but also her connection to someone like Harriet Hosmer. And in part, Emma Stebbins' reputation was significantly less controversial, as we've heard, than someone like Harriet Hosmer, who seems to have gone out of her way to be a bit controversial sometimes. She wore frequently very masculine clothing. She seems to have enjoyed very much engaging in a public gender play, whereas reviews of Emma Stebbins' work and of her lifestyle and her studio, which were so publicly commented upon, never seems to describe her as anything other than incredibly respectable. And photographs of her with Cushman, with others, show her, and that painting as well by Henry Inman, show her as really a pinnacle of upper middle class traditional femininity. And so despite that, there seems to be an incredible discomfort when her work sometimes transcends that boundary with something like the Bethesda Fountain, where in fact one of the critiques was that it was not sufficiently blended as a masculine and feminine work if it was going to try to be neuter, which is the word that they've used. And Stebbins was using this perhaps as a way of setting out her stall, in that I said that she was heavily informed by the physical space of Rome. She's deeply aware of the iconography of a fountain in the Roman milieu, and what she is responding to are works that are completely different. And it's giving her the opportunity to carve that space out for herself, and then potentially not entirely succeeding. And you see again here something by Chauncey Bradley Ives, which is a slightly more traditional water spirit with the clinging wet drapery that you really expect from a nymph, as opposed to the angel of Siloam coming down to trouble the healing waters of the historic Bethesda Fountain. And then last we have Satan, which is, I will admit, my favorite of these works because it is so unusual. And I think its absence as a physical object allows for quite a lot of hypothetical and creative thinking about what it might have actually looked like in a finished work. And it is, I think, like the Commerce and Industry and some of her more labor-driven figures, a really interesting example of a woman creating a masculine icon. This is Satan coming down to summon his legions from Milton's poem. And it's not necessarily the same kind of Satan that we are used to seeing, but that really, really sexual, I think it's quite sexy, that body stocking, the scaled armor inspired by figures on Trajan's column, which both hides and denies and reveals quite a lot of that body. You can see the highly specific bulge of his genitalia, which is something that you don't normally get. She normally conceals the genitals a bit more delicately, with things like the lotus eater having a flowering branch or autumn having some fantastic grapes. This, like commerce, in fact, where you can see that he dresses to the left, as my camera freezes in a very elegant way, really allows for an exploration of Satan as a sexually provocative figure. And it's fun to imagine this work as a colossal bronze or a colossal marble, and what that material tension, the material facts of that work might have allowed. I think here, living in Britain, we have quite a lot of public sculptures that have gone interesting patinas because they have been used as fertility charms or good luck charms, and imagining what an audience responding to the hyper tactile surface of a bronze sculpture of Satan like this, where that sexuality is so thrusting, really, compared to the more ephebic or effeminate works that she produced, really challenges what we might expect a 19th century woman artist to do. And so I will wrap up there and stop screen sharing so that we can all hopefully answer some questions. But I hope that people have managed to get to this exhibition and see these fantastic works in person.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your presentations, for your contributions to the book. For those listening, we have some questions coming into the chat, but this is your time to use the Q&A button below. Panelists, you can see the questions coming in, right? Are there any that you would like to address, or I can start picking some out? Okay, so I'm going to start with the Bethesda fountain because each of you in your essays touched on it a bit, and we didn't really have time to get, we could do a full panel just on that work alone. And so I wanted to ask each of you, but maybe starting with Laura, if you have some additional insight into that fountain work through the different, perspectives and methodologies that you each brought to your work.
Right. Thank you, Carly. And yes, in kind of whittling down my presentation for today, I completely cut out the Bethesda fountain front, which is I go into some detail about in my essay in the catalog as well. But in the catalog or in my research, I particularly looked at the way the fountain responds to ideas about public health at a moment. Again, I had mentioned when Stebbins was not well, because of her, inhaling of marble dust in her work, and then also Charlotte Cushman had breast cancer as well, and so they were looking. And this was a time when water cures were especially popular, and Cushman and Stebbins were participating in that as well. So this idea of clean circulating water, I think was important for public health, and there was a whole movement around this at the time that I believe Stebbins and Cushman bought into, and I argue in my essay that the fountain, as it celebrates the bringing of clean water to New York. I also have written about the Philadelphia Waterworks before, so that's kind of coming into play here too. Is celebrating this bringing of clean water into the city, and it's expressed through the fountain itself.
Great. And Katrin, anything you would like to add in about the fountain? And you briefly mentioned the way Cushman and Stebbins attempted to kind of mold the reception of that work or guide the reception of the work, so that by the time it was unveiled in 1873, it had already been discussed in newspapers and also in private correspondence.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I'm highlighting in my essay has already just been addressed by Laura, is that when Cushman so intensely reacts to the criticism of the work, some have basically argued, well, this is because it was modeled on her, right? It looks like her, it has kind of a body shaped like her. So it must have been vanity on Cushman's part that she was so kind of attacked by the attack on the fountain. But I do think it is relevant to also highlight that at that moment, the water cure was central to her. She had undergone operations, and she was trying to kind of alleviate the pain resulting from that through various water cures in Europe and in the US. And so this kind of attack on what this fountain stood for, at least to me, it seemed would have been more relevant in that context, particularly also because this would have been more closely tied to kind of the public reception of it, and what Stebbins also highlighted, what she connected with it. And so I think kind of guiding the reading of the fountain in that direction would have been valuable to her. And I also stressed how some of the kind of studio visits before the unveiling are seemingly really kind of designed to do exactly that. So journalists who were also friends of Stebbins and Cushman would come in and would write for US American presses about how they saw the design, what the design stands for, what its biblical references are, so that people would kind of be primed to read it, quote unquote, correctly once it would be unveiled. And I think one of the things that I found striking is that seemingly Stebbins only saw the final result when the public did. And so there's an indication that she might not really have seen it in like its final bronze form until it was actually in New York, which sounds stressful.
And Melissa, I wonder if there's anything further you want to say about the fountain. But if not, we've also got a question here for you about the Satan, and if you think, why might we think that work did not get completed in marble or bronze, and did it have something to do with this provocative subject matter? Just kind of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that there were so many unfinished works in the scrapbook, and it's not just Stebbins, it's Hosmer as well, makes huge numbers of references to works for which she has made clay models or even full-size plaster maquettes that never get realized. And in part, this is because of the cost of materials. It's so expensive, they can't just make things sort of on spec, really. But I do think that that is a particularly challenging work. And if it was one that she wanted to produce in marble in particular, the material challenges of producing a sculpture, even if it was quite small, in that scale with the tensile problems around outstretched arms, outstretched wings, it would have been technically very difficult. And the bronze would have been potentially technically easier, but it was also potentially leaning into a slightly more avant-garde audience. It responds to more things that are happening in France, which she or her clientele may not have entirely been comfortable with. But I do think that she was also potentially making work in that scale, in that material, to show what she could do. And it may not have ever been intended to be produced as a full-scale work, but may have been some kind of performance piece. And I think that that element of creativity in the women artists in particular is sometimes overlooked, that these might be produced as exercises or as demonstrations of originality and creativity that allows them to be a bit freer, and Stebbins in particular to be a bit more outre, a bit more experimental with what they were going to do. And if somebody wanted to buy it, great. But may have been produced as a way of going, look, I can be a bit edgy too, without having to commit the resources to a finished marble or bronze piece.
I think that's a great point, and it leads to some of the other questions coming in. One just asking, so she's in Rome for 13 to 14 years. She always leaves Rome in the summer. Sometimes she's gone for longer periods. So the time that she has in Rome to make sculpture is kind of limited. So the question is like, how large is her body of work? And so there's a wonderful scrapbook at the Archives of American Art created by her sister that records both the finished and the unfinished works. And I think there are about 30 of these compositions that she created in clay or plaster, and those were photographed. Number of subjects created in marble is maybe about 15 or 16, but some of those marbles are created in multiple. So there are maybe 5 or 6 versions of the Lotus Eater bust. There are multiple versions of the Cushman bust, but still only 4 or 5, so not huge numbers. And so there's another question here. All of us could take up, maybe Laura, I mean, all of you, please chime in also with your final thoughts. But the question is, why so few in bronze? Did she have a preference for marble? And maybe why, in addition to this, the fact that she's just not in Rome for a long time, why is her body of work more limited than Harriet Hosmer's, for example? So, okay, Melissa goes first, and then Laura and Katrin, your final thoughts before we sign off.
So I think her body of work is limited compared to Hosmer's because Hosmer goes to Rome when she's like 25. She stays until about 1900, even though she knocks off quite a lot of the work. Later, she also has a colossal studio with tens of Italian workmen who do quite a lot of the work for her in actually carving the marble, and she was critiqued for letting her workmen take the marbles further than anybody else in the city did, where many of the artists would leave a quarter of an inch left for the artist to finish. She often had her artisans take down to the last eighth of an inch. So she had this colossal, like industrial scale puck production factory, really, but just had more time and more material support to do it compared to Cushman's much more constrained window of productivity and the fact that she was doing most of the actual manual labor herself. That's, I think, really the material reasons why.
Katrin, I wonder if you could chime in about also the amount of time it takes to just negotiate these commissions and how that might cut into working time. I'm thinking about Horace Mann, for example.
Yeah, please don't. No, I think one of the other things that is clearly an important point, but also from the letters to Anne Whitney, there are some indications that she just really likes to have control over her work, and there's just less of that with bronze. So in marble, she could really do the finishing touches, and with a bronze statue, it is at some point shut out of her work, out of her hands, and there's just no control anymore. And we do also get from her letters with Whitney, but also with others, and also particularly from the Cushman letters, just how long it took to to find out which foundry would be the right one, and then negotiate these prices, and then get it somewhere, and then ensure that it's actually shipped properly. And so the Horace Mann, it's a years-long saga, and like I do understand why that would have been not particularly attractive for her, but I think that the main reason really might be, at least from judging from these letters, that it's out of her hands, and she really preferred to do the finishing touches. I have maybe one comment to how much we know of her work. In some of the letters, I found at least a reference to one additional Roman bust that is never more specified. Like there are 2 or 3 letters are like, I'm working on this, I'm sketches of this. So I think there might have been more, maybe not in clay, but at least like planned to do. But as you already indicated, she's traveling a lot. She's also traveling more than she might want to, partially because Cushman has a rather tight tour schedule at some point. Her family is demanding her time, her health, and then later Cushman. So as Melissa already said, she's just not in Rome for that long of a time. She has much more familial obligations, much more care obligations also later on in her life than Hosmer would have had. And so obviously this all kind of cut in on the time that she could actually be that productive.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, if you could also talk about, we also know about other works commissioned by, perhaps intended for Central Park, that do not come to fruition. So if you want to share about those.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the summaries that were given are pretty kind of help sums it up. But yeah, she was initially it was anticipated that she would create more work for Central Park, and that just never came to fruition. And also, just to add to what everyone else was saying, the Angel of the Waters, the Bethesda Fountain sculpture was cast in Munich, and then went to the United States. So it's just like, think about all the kind of distance that these pieces, the maquette had to go to Munich, and then the piece had to be cast, and that had to be paid for, and it took her a while to get the actual funds from Central Park to pay for her sculpture. So it was like this very drawn out process that took a very long time, and then the bronze had to get to to New York. So it's where the creation of a marble sculpture could feasibly happen in her studio. Although I imagine she must have had some help especially with the works that have multiple copies of them. Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of
Right. So
labor.
right. So for Central Park, these figures of the Four Seasons never get completed, and also the dispensing gates and receiving gates of the reservoir, which she models, but are never completed in marble or bronze.
And part of
Okay.
that might be the Central Park Commission's, not lack of interest in pursuing more work just for financial reasons too.
Right. Right. During the Civil War and the aftermath. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. We will conclude this panel. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you will please visit the show at the Heckscher Museum. If a trip to Long Island is not in your future, the show will be traveling to 4 venues via Art Bridges, and the Art Bridges Foundation will be announcing that soon. So the show will tour nationally, but it's on view at the Heckscher until March 15 of 2026. So see you there, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.